All right, guys, so today's video is going to be about government spending. And we've talked about how government acts as a consumer in the economy, and they are a part of the aggregate demand curve. And so government policy can effectively impact the conditions in the economy at any given time. So here is a pie chart of the federal government spending budget proposal for 2020. And you can see where the biggest chunks of this pie chart are allocated toward. So for instance, like healthcare, defense, about $1 trillion, and some of the other smaller areas of spending. Effectively, government spending is broken down into two types of spending. One is referred to as mandatory spending, and the other is discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is spending that is done by the government based on laws created many years before that promise funding or payments to certain programs. So they really can't touch the mandatory spending, but what they can touch or adjust is discretionary spending. So when you talk about discretionary spending, it is at the discretion of that administration to adjust the spending, whether it be on defense or education, NASA and science, research and development. So those things can be increased or decreased, whereas mandatory spending cannot. To give you an example of discretionary spending, we can look at the Trump's proposal in 2019 for a border wall, and President Trump asked for a certain amount of money for this project, but nonetheless, this would be an example of discretionary spending, as he can either receive increased or decreased funding from Congress to build the wall or not. Now let's take a look at this graph, which represents the government spending from 1965 up into about 2012, and then the government revenue, which represents the amount of money that they receive in the tax dollars. And what you can see is that when the two lines intersect or overlap, such as these two areas, basically you have a situation where spending is equal to revenue. So if spending is equal to revenue, that means that the same amount of money they are collecting in tax revenue is equal to the amount of money they are spending. This is referred to as a balanced budget. Now, as you notice, historically, there are these gaps between spending and revenue. And when you see these gaps between spending and revenue, this is an indication where the government is actually spending more than they have in revenue. And so for these years, these gaps, the government is actually running a budget deficit. And again, the deficit represents a situation where spending is greater than revenue. Now, there was this time period here where revenue was greater than spending. The government was running what are called surpluses. And so if the government is running a budget surplus, that means that they have more money in tax revenue than they have in spending. So these three conditions can exist, but you can see historically it is more common for the United States to have budget deficits than it is to have balanced budgets or surpluses. Now, to give you some relatively recent context, this was an article presented in 2018, which noted how the president's budget included a deficit of $779 billion. So what that means is that the government was going to spend more than they had, to the tune of around $800 billion. So the three terms that we really need to know about are deficits, surpluses, and balanced budgets. If we have a balanced budget, that means that the same amount of money coming in tax revenue is the same amount of money being spent by the government, or that revenue is equal to spending. And really, President Clinton's administration were not only running balanced budgets, but also running budget surpluses. So the budget surplus, once again, is where spending is less than revenue, or revenue is greater than spending. Now, what is more common is a budget deficit. And a budget deficit represents where the government is spending more than they have. So how do we deal with a budget deficit? Number one, the government could reduce spending. However, that is not typically a popular thing to do. The second thing that the government could do is increase taxes. But again, that's not a popular thing to promote amongst the general public. People don't generally like to see taxes increase. So again, what does the government do? Well, a lot of times what they'll do is borrow. And how do they borrow? Well, they borrow by selling original bonds on a primary market. All right, so bonds are sold either domestically or globally. If they are sold domestically, then basically what happens is U.S. investors are going to be buying these bonds directly from the government. Of course, the Federal Reserve buys bonds on secondary markets from banks and investors, so they hold a big portion of it. So the U.S. public holds about $7 trillion worth of the debt at this time, which is about 33% of the debt overall. China and Japan are the two biggest holders of U.S. debt globally. So now let's talk about the distinction between the national debt and a budget deficit. The budget deficit represents a shortfall in revenue relative to spending for one fiscal year. So the budget can be in balance or surplus, and we still, as a nation, have a national debt. The national debt represents the total amount of borrowing and the total amount of money that is owed to either American citizens or some other entity globally at any given time based on previous years of borrowing. So there is a distinction between a deficit and the debt. The debt is all the borrowing, and the deficit is the borrowing for 1 year. Okay, now let's take a look at the U.S. debt clock, which is a pretty popular website that people refer to when they look at the debt. And what you can see here is the total U.S. national debt right now is around $23 trillion. If you divide that per every citizen in the United States, that amounts to about $73,000 per person. Of course, not everybody pays taxes, and not everybody is capable of paying taxes. So if you were to divide that by the total taxpayer, and you can see here it's about $190,000. This little box here represents the deficit for the previous year or the year coming up, which is over $1 trillion. And if you scroll down a bit, you can see the actual areas of spending on Medicare, Social Security, and defense. And remember, Medicare and Social Security are mandatory spending, whereas defense is not.